Void Miner, Children of the Belt, Part 2, Chapter 6, Quiet Persistence. The derelict station groaned around him as though it resented his presence. Arg had spent his life listening to ships, to stations, to hulls straining against the void, and this one was no different. Metal bent with a sigh, conduits ticked with the slow bleed of power. Atmosphere whispered faintly in places where the seals weren't perfect. It was alive in its way, not dead, but limping forward through the sheer will and stubborn hands of whoever patched it together. He crouched near the corner of a dim corridor, the same place where he had faced down the cluster of sharp-eyed children the night before. They hadn't driven him off, but they hadn't accepted him either. They'd taken the ration pack he had left as bait and necessity both. He had returned to find the wrapper gone, crumbs scattered, and faint footprints pressed into the dust near the wall. They were watching, always watching. Patience was the only tool that mattered now. Patience and presence. He let his hands work at the small panel near the junction. A patch of conduit, long since jury-rigged with wires, twisted into crude knots. The repairs were functional in the most desperate sense, but dangerous. A spark here could have meant a fire, or a system cascade failure, or worse. Ark pulled his tools from the small kit he had carried in from the widow, laying them out carefully where the children would see. Not weapons, not threats, just tools. He began to strip and reseat the wiring, humming low under his breath. A habit, really, a rhythm that steadied him. The sound carried in the silence of the corridor. Not loud, but insistent. A signal that he wasn't hiding. He wasn't sneaking. If they wanted to see him, they would. Minutes stretched. Sweat gathered in the collar of his suit, though the air here was cold enough to bite. The tension of being watched prickled at the back of his neck. At least, he caught the faintest movement reflected in the gleam of a polished wrench. Shadows, small, crouched, eyes wide and unblinking. He said nothing, but kept working, hands steady, methodical. A child's whisper carried just faintly across the corridor, too soft to make out, but sharp with suspicion. Ark tightened the last connector, checked the voltage with a reader, and slid the panel shut. The faint hum of current stabilized, the flicker of lights in the ceiling smoothing out into a steady glow. He leaned back on his heels, wiped his hands on a rag, and let the silence speak for him. When he rose to leave, he set down another ration pack on the deck, waited so it wouldn't drift or shift, not tossed, not hidden, placed. An offering, not a bribe. He walked away without looking back, boots heavy on the deck so they would know exactly where he was going. The pattern continued for days. He returned each cycle to a new spot in the station. A failing vent here, a leaking seal there. He repaired what he could with the small supply kit, never hiding his actions, never rushing. Always steady, always patient. He left food each time, simple sealed packs that would last, nothing extravagant. And each time, when he circled back hours later, the food was gone. Not discarded, not ignored. Taken. He began to notice the signs of their watching. A boot scuff in the dust, a reflection in a warped panel. Once, the faintest sound of laughter before it cut off sharp as a knife. They weren't ready to approach. Not yet. But curiosity was fighting against fear. And curiosity always won, eventually. At the hub, Kara walked slower than she once did. Her body hadn't changed enough for strangers to notice, but she knew. And her steps carried the weight of that knowledge. 3 months. Fatigue came quicker now. A lingering heaviness in her limbs, though she forced herself to move with purpose. The guild meetings hadn't slowed. If anything, they'd pressed harder now that Ark was gone. factions within the belt tugging at one another with renewed impatience. She sat in the med wing one morning, pretending to study a data slate while the quiet hum of the machine soothed her nerves. The nurse gave her a brief look, then moved on, satisfied by the regularity of her vitals. Kara barely heard. Her thoughts trailed away, back to Arg, picturing him in the hollow corridors of that broken station, shadows darting in and out of his path. She wondered if he was eating enough, if he was sleeping, if he remembered that his stubborn patience was not always a shield against danger. When she returned to her quarters, she touched the small trinket Arg had left her, nothing more than a bent piece of metal from the widow's first major patch job, polished smooth over years of handling. It was a promise, not of safety, but of persistence. They had survived worse. They would survive this. Still, the quiet hours weighed heavy, and she carried them alone. Back in the derelict, Arg adjusted slowly to the rhythm of life here. He began to map their patterns. By the sounds of scraping metal, he could tell where they nested. By timing of the faintest footsteps, he began to guess at their shifts. When the youngest were guarded, when the older ones prowled, he marked the places they avoided, the spaces they lingered. Each clue brought him closer to understanding, though not yet close enough to entry. The first true shift came without warning. He was sealing a crack in a bulkhead near a junction, welding a scrap plate over the stress line, when a sound cut through the hiss of a torch. A voice, high and uncertain. "You're wasting that." Arg killed the flame and turned his head slowly. The boy couldn't have been more than 9, skinny as a wire, eyes wide but fierce. He held no weapon, just a piece of pipe he probably carried for show more than threat. His knuckles were white on the metal, his stance jittery but defiant. Arg didn't smile. He didn't move closer. He simply let the torch rest at his side. "Not wasted," he said. "If the crack spreads, that wall gives. Then the air goes. You like breathing, don't you?" The boy's eyes narrowed, suspicion tangled with confusion. Then with the faintest spark of thought, he didn't answer, but he didn't run either. That was enough. Arg turned back to his work, lit the torch, and kept welding, each motion slow enough for the boy to follow. When the seal was finished, he shut down the torch, set it aside, and stepped back. "You'll hear it hold now," he said, tapping the plate with his knuckles. "Solid. Safer." The boy didn't respond. He stood there a moment longer, then darted off down the corridor, pipe clanking against the deck. Arg let him go, his pulse steady. The first crack in the wall between them had formed. The days that followed deepened the pattern. The youngest appeared more often, peeking around corners, whispering questions before vanishing into the shadows. The older ones still scowled, still hissed threats, still tightened their grip on whatever weapon they carried when he drew near. But the curiosity of the little ones betrayed the balance, and Arg knew it was only a matter of time before the others followed. He kept working, fixing what he could, leaving food where they could take it without shame. Waiting, always waiting. Patience was a weapon sharper than any blade. Chapter 7. Saving Grace. Arg had learned to live with silence, not the silence of empty rooms or the lull between words, but the silence that pressed in from every angle. The silence of vacuum beyond thin walls. The silence that could swallow a man whole if he let it. The derelict station knew that silence well. It wore it like a second skin. Every corridor whispered the same truth. You are not welcome here, but you are still alive. He had been on the station long enough to know its heartbeat. He could tell which generators were close to burning out, which conduits bled current they couldn't spare, which seals leaked precious air molecule by molecule. He could also tell which shadows were his and which belonged to the children. Their movements had rhythm too, not random, not wild, calculated in their own way. The older ones prowled with hostility, but the youngest drifted closer each day, drawn by curiosity that outpaced fear. That morning he had taken tools out to the exterior. The hull needed eyes on it, and there was no one else willing or able to risk it. He worked slow, deliberate, tether clipped to a rusting anchor point. His gloves thick, but dexterous enough to set a weld where the plating had bent away. The station groaned against him. Metal flexed where it shouldn't. Every vibration carried through his suit like a growl. He tightened the new bracket into place, his breath fogging the inside of the helmet with the exertion. He didn't stop. Couldn't. A gap in the hull was death waiting patiently for its moment. Movement caught his eye. He froze, welding torch hovering a hair above the joint. A shape floated just outside the arc of his light. Small, thin, wrong. Then the comm in his helmet crackled. Not from his suit, but faint, piggybacking on the station's open broadcast channel. A child's voice, high and strained. "Can't. Rope stuck." Ark's chest tightened. His eye swept the shadow until he spotted it. A figure dangling just beyond the hull, tether twisted around a jagged piece of metal jutting from the frame. The child, he couldn't tell boy or girl at this distance, was kicking, panicked, hands clawing at the cable, suit jerking against the strain. The tether held, but barely. One sharp tug, and it would sever. Ark didn't hesitate. He thumbed his comm. "Stay still," he said, voice steady. "Don't fight it. I'm coming." No answer came, just the harsh rasp of breath over the channel. Ark pushed off the hull, one hand guiding along the safety line, the other clutching the emergency clap from his belt. His suit thrusters gave him a slow push, enough to close the distance without overcorrection. The child thrashed again. The tether groaned. Ark's jaw clenched. He reached them, braced a boot against the metal frame, and anchored himself with one hand. The jagged edge had chewed half through the cable already. A second more, and it would have been gone. "Look at me," Arg said, voice firm. "Eyes here. You're not falling. You hear me?" Wide, terrified eyes turned toward him. Too young for this. Too small. "Good," he muttered, sliding the clamp into place. With practice ease, he cut the frayed tether free and locked the new line into the child's belt. He tugged once, hard, to show it would hold. "Safe now. We're going back." The child didn't speak. Their chest heaved, visor fogged, but the wild panic dulled into stunned silence. Arg wrapped one arm around them, pushed off the wreckage, and let the tether drag them back toward the station airlock. The re-entry was clumsy. He guided them through, sealed the inner door, and cycled the chamber. Air rushed in, thin but blessed. The child collapsed onto the deck, ripping their helmet off and gasping like they'd never breathed before. Arg removed his own helmet, slowly, setting it aside. He crouched, not too close, not too far. "You're fine," he said, tone flat, but not unkind. "You'll keep breathing. That's what matters." The child blinked at him, lips trembling. Then in a whisper, "You didn't have to." Ark's brow furrowed. "Course I did." Silence stretched. Then the sound of feet, many feet, echoed down the corridor. The others had come, the older ones first, faces hard, weapons clenched. Behind them, more children clustered, eyes darting from Arg to the rescued one. Arg rose slowly, hands visible. He didn't step away. He let them see. The rescued child scrambled to their feet, chest still heaving and shouting, voice cracking with the force of it. "He saved me!" The words struck harder than any weapon. The older ones froze. Their suspicion didn't vanish, not by a long stretch, but the balance shifted. One of their own had spoken, one they trusted. A boy, nearly Arg's shoulder height, older, harder, sneered. Doesn't mean he belongs here. Arg didn't argue. He only said, I'm not here to belong. I'm here to make sure the air holds, the lights stay on, and none of you die in the dark. What you do with that is your own choice. The rescued child stepped closer to him, not behind him, but near, close enough to be seen, choosing. The older boy's jaw tightened. Tension rippled through the group, but it didn't break into violence. Not this time. Arg gathered his tools, slow, deliberate. He slung the kit over his shoulder and walked past them without another word, boots heavy on the deck. The corridor parted around him. Eyes followed, some sharp, some suspicious, some unreadable, and one pair, wide and grateful. For the first time since he had set foot on the derelict, Arg felt the silence shift. Not gone, not broken, but softer at the edges. On the hub, Kara moved through her duties with careful precision. Her pregnancy was showing now, if only slightly, enough that her clothes no longer hid it entirely. She felt the weight of glances in the guild hall, some curious, some calculating. In private, she pressed her hand to her belly and whispered promises the child could not hear. She thought often of Arg, imagined his heavy boots on the hollow metal, his shoulders hunched against a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. She wondered if he knew how much she worried. She wondered if he understood that she carried both of them now, not just the child, but the waiting, the absence, the long shadow of silence he left behind. When she stood in the guild chamber, she held her ground with quiet fire. She reminded herself that he would return, that he would not fail where children's lives hung in the balance. He never had. Patience, she told herself. Patience and persistence. The same tools he carried. The same tools she must learn to wield. Arg lay awake that night on the derelict, back against cold metal, listening to the station creak. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. Not cruel, not sharp, just laughter. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since arriving, let himself believe he was no longer entirely an intruder. Chapter 8. Practical Lessons. Arg had never thought of himself as a teacher. Survival didn't leave much room for lessons. Either you lived long enough to figure it out, or you didn't. But the station was changing, and so were the children. The rescue, on the whole, hadn't made them family, hadn't bought their trust outright, but it had cracked something open. They no longer watched him only as an intruder, but watched him as a possibility. It began small, like all things worth keeping. The youngest ones, the ones barely old enough to lace their boots without help, started drifting closer when he worked in the air processor. They lingered just inside the shadows, eyes wide, lips pressed thin to hide their interest. Arg let them stay. He spoke aloud while he worked, not to them, but to himself in a voice meant to carry. Which wrench did what? Why he checked seals twice. How much grease was too much? Words dropped like crumbs for anyone who cared to pick them up. At first, they only stared. Then one boy, hair shorn, ragged with a blonde too dull, crouched beside him and held out a bolt he'd dropped. Arg took it, nodded once, and kept working. He didn't thank him. Gratitude would have embarrassed the boy. Respect was quieter than that. By the second day, Arg had a shadow. The boy, Tio, he learned from the others, kept showing up. At first, he only handed over tools, fumbling with names, then began asking questions in bursts. like rocks spat from a mining drill. Why this seal? Not that. What happened if the filter clogged? Could you really patch a crack with tape and prayer? Arg answered each one without flourish. Direct, plain. The boy listened, soaking it up like the station itself drank power. The older ones noticed. Suspicion sharpened into mockery. What are you going to be, his little apprentice now? One sneered, voice carrying through the thin-walled corridor. Teo flushed but didn't move. Arg kept working, his shoulders broad and steady, making no defense, no argument. When the laughter faded, the boy was still there, jaw set in stubborn defiance. Arg knew then he had something worth building. It wasn't easy, teaching never was, but when your students believed that they already knew the only lesson that mattered, survive at any cost. Arg forced patience into his hand, into his voice. He made them patch small leaks in scrap piping, then dunk the work in recycled water to watch for bubbles. He had them rewire an old console, showing how power flowed in circuits like blood through veins. He even staged a ration count, making them measure beans and powder down to the gram. When he asked them to imagine what happened if one careless hand spoiled the balance. Some of them scoffed, some rolled their eyes and stormed out, but some stayed. And those who stayed learned. Humor crept in where it didn't belong, but was needed all the same. One boy, wiry and sharp-tongued, snuck a dead rat into the intake pipe just to see Arg's reaction. Arg dragged it out, held it up by the tail, and said flatly, "Congratulations, you've just invented the worst air freshener in the belt." Even the sullen ones laughed at that. The sound brittle but real. The girls learned quicker than the boys, though they pretended otherwise. One, Ariel, had fingers as quick as any techs Arg had ever known. She stripped wiring blind, testing herself, daring him to say she couldn't. He never did. Instead, he gave her harder tasks. She cursed him for it, loudly and often. But her grin afterward told him she wanted the challenge. Teo remained in his shadow, always nearby, always watching. Arg didn't discourage him. If anything, he leaned on the boy more, letting him explain steps to the others. The first time, Teo fumbled, cheeks burning. Arg clapped him on the shoulder. "Good enough," he said. "Mistakes mean you tried." The boy straightened as though given a gift heavier than gold. Not everyone warmed. The older ones, the self-appointed leaders, kept their distance. They allowed him space, but only grudgingly, suspicion written in every narrowed eye. Arg didn't push them. He knew better. Trust forced was trust lost. He let them stew, let them watch their younger kin return with cleaner clothes, patch leaks, and rations measured fair. He let them see proof before words could sway. Far from the derelict, Kara felt the same slow grind of patience. Her days were filled with mediation. Two mining crew disputed territories near the hub's outer ring, their tempers as volatile as their equipment. Kara sat through hours of heated words, her hands folded, her face calm. Inside, fatigue gnawed. She rubbed her belly when no one watched, the slight swell now impossible to ignore. 3 months along. The symptoms lingered, nausea in the mornings, bone-deep tiredness in the evenings. But she pressed through. She found herself thinking of Arg when the arguments grew too sharp. What would he say? Likely nothing. He'd stand, arms crossed, presence alone enough to cool the fire. She had no such shield. Words were her tools, and she wielded them carefully, building compromises thread by fragile thread. At night, when the hall quieted, she lay awake in her quarters. The hub thrummed around her, alive with 1,000 lives. Somewhere out there, Ark moved through corridors of silence, teaching children who had never known a parent. She imagined his voice, steady and low, explaining patience to a boy with wide eyes. It comforted her more than she'd admit. On the derelict, Ark faced his own trial of patience. One evening, after hours bent over failing conduits, he caught two of the older boys sneaking out with stolen rations. They froze when they saw him. Guilt scrawled across their faces. For a heartbeat, he thought they'd attacked. Instead, they waited, tense, for judgment. Ark didn't raise his voice, didn't grab their arms. He only said, "You take food, the little ones go hungry. That's the only truth that matters." One spat at his boots, the other looked away. Ark turned, walked back to the processor, and left them standing there. The next morning, a bag of rations appeared at his door, untouched. He said nothing of it, but the message had landed. Lessons, he realized, weren't only about air and power and food. They were about choices, about what survival meant when it wasn't only about yourself. The children didn't know it yet, but they were learning more than repairs. They were learning the shape of community. And Arg, as he wiped grease from his hands and watched Teo teach another boy to tighten a seal, thought of Kara and the child growing inside her. He wondered if fatherhood wasn't teaching after all, if every day, every word, was practice for the life he hadn't met yet. The station still creaked, shadows still whispered, but where there had been only silence, there was now the faint murmur of lessons past, of laughter caught between curses, of children beginning, however reluctantly, to grow. Chapter 9. Reckless Runs. The first signs came as whispers through the derelict's thin corridors, shadows moving where they shouldn't, a half-empty toolkit left behind, the faint scrape of boots at odd hours. Ark had lived long enough in hostile space to know when someone was planning something they didn't want him to see. The orphans were restless. Patience had carried him this far. He'd given them food, knowledge, even the beginnings of structure. But patience was a thin shield against pride, and pride was burning in the older ones like a fuse. They tolerated his presence now, tolerated his lessons, but they were not ready to admit they needed him. They wanted proof they could do without. He knew what was coming before the station told him. He found evidence in the scuffed marks near the docking bay, in the way Teo avoided his eyes, in the hushed laughter cut off the moment he entered a room. They were going out, alone. It happened on the fourth cycle after his EVA rescue. Arg woke to the groan of air cycling unevenly through the ducts, followed by silence in the quarters where children should have been. Too many bunks empty, too much quiet. He moved fast, boots silent, shoulders brushing against the narrow corridors. When he reached the bay, the old lock indicators confirmed it. The hatch had cycled less than an hour ago. His jaw clenched. Mining run. Not a safe one, either. Not with their crude gear. Not with no backup. The nearby wreckage fields were riddled with sharp debris and unstable ore veins, the kind that could vent gas or collapse under a drill's bite. Arg had warned him. They hadn't listened. He forced himself to breathe slowly. Chasing them blindly would only make things worse. If they thought he didn't trust them, they'd dig in their heels. But if he did nothing, they'd die. Arg suited up, fingers steady even as his stomach knotted. The widow's sensors gave him a thin thread of data, barely enough to trace the orphan's trajectory. He followed it out into the field, every muscle tense. The wrecks loomed around him, old war hulks twisted into jagged metal spires. Ore veins glowed faintly where solar light caught them, promising wealth and ruin in equal measure. He spotted the scavenger sled first, an ugly patchwork of plating and thrusters, clearly their handiwork. It drifted between two hulks, drills already biting into an exposed vein. Then he heard it over the open channel. Laughter, strained but giddy. The kind of laughter that came from being alive in a place that should have killed you. Keep it steady. We'll haul enough to trade for a month. More like two if they don't screw it up. The voices cracked with youth, brittle bravado masking the danger. Ark's hands tightened on the controls. He watched as one boy, Kerr, the sharp-tongued one, leaned too far over the sled's edge, guiding the drill into a seam. Sparks spat into the void. The oar shifted. Arg saw the fracture-lined spiderweb across the rock. His gut dropped. Pull back, Arg barked into the comm. Now, that vein's unstable. The channel went silent. Then Kerr's voice, mocking, too loud. We don't need your orders, old man. The seam cracked open. Gas vented in a violent burst, throwing shards of rocks and metal spinning outward. The sled lurched, tethered lines snapping taut. One child screamed. The drill spun free, tumbling end over end. Arg cursed under his breath. He fired thrusters, closing the distance. His hands moved without hesitation, clipping onto the sled's edge, locking himself down. Stay low. Hold on, he shouted, his voice cut through the panic. Even the defiant ones obeyed when the void itself roared. He yanked the manual override, forcing the sled's thrusters into reverse. The craft shuddered, groaned, but steadied. Fragments still rained around them, pinging against the hull plates, but the worst of it passed. The children clung to the sled, wide eyes, chest heaving. Kerr's face was pale behind his visor. No words came now. Arg killed the remaining drill power, slammed the panel shut, and stared at them one by one. His voice was low, steady, the kind that carried more weight than shouting ever could. You think survival is about being fearless? It's not. It's about knowing when to stop before the void swallows you. You forget that, you die. And worse, you take everyone with you. No one answered. The silence was heavier than the wreckage around them. He turned the sled back toward the station, guiding it with slow precision. The children didn't protest, not one word. Back on the derelict, the airlock cycled open. The children shuffled off the sled, some trembling, some sullen. Kerr lingered, jaw tight, shame burning in his eyes. Arg met his gaze, but said nothing. Lessons had already been carved into their bones. Teo was the first to break the silence. He looked at Arg, then at the others, and spoke, barely above a whisper. We'd all be dead if he hadn't come. The words landed like a hammer. Some nodded, reluctant but real. Kerr flinched, then turned away, fists clenched. Arg said nothing more. He didn't need to. They would remember. Far from the wreck field, Kara stood in the hub's guild chamber, listening to another dispute over trade routes. Her patience frayed at the edges. But she kept her composure. She felt the weight of her pregnancy now. 3 months, maybe a little more. Fatigue tugged at her bones, but she refused to bend under it. As voices rose around her, she thought of Arg, imagined him standing in some broken corridor with children clinging to life by his steadiness alone. She envied his clarity. The void was harsh, but its rules were simple. Survive or don't. The hub's rules were messier, layered with politics and pride. Still, she found herself smiling faintly, one hand brushing her belly. Arg was teaching survival in his way. She was teaching it in hers. Different battlefields, same war. That night, Arg lay awake, listening to the station creak. The children were quieter than usual, their defiance dulled into thought. For the first time, he felt not just their suspicion, but their respect. grudging, fragile, but real. He exhaled slow. The lesson had been brutal, but it had stuck. And in the silence that followed, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they were learning. Chapter 10. Mentorship Emerges. The station was quieter than Arg had ever known it. Not silent. Silence belongs to the void, but quiet in a way that hinted at something shifting. The children had stopped looking at him like a predator lurking in their halls. They had stopped testing him with petty sabotage and reckless defiance. Not entirely, not all at once, but enough that the air felt less sharp, less hostile. After the near disaster in the wreck field, their pride had been bloodied. Arg could see it in their eyes. The fear still lurking, the memory of gas venting, of the sled spinning wild. They had survived, not because of their skill, but because he had been there. That was a bitter lesson, and bitter lessons stayed longest. He didn't press it. He didn't need to. The void had done the teaching for him. It began with Teo, as so many of these changes seemed to. The boy trailed him everywhere, too curious to keep distance. Arg let him. Better one shadow than a dozen enemies. What he hadn't expected was Teo's voice, thin, eager, repeating Arg's instructions back to the younger ones. This one here, see? If it leaks, you feel it with your hand, not your ear. Sound lies, touch doesn't. Arg froze in the middle of tightening a joint. He glanced over his shoulder, watching as the boy demonstrated with a scrap pipe and a patched filter. The two smallest children crouched close, eyes round, nodding along. The words were his. The lesson was his. But the voice was not. For a long time, Arg said nothing. Then he turned back to his work, jaw set, hiding the flicker of something he didn't want to name. It spread from there. Ariel, the wiry girl with quick hands, started teaching others how to strip wire without nicking the copper. She snapped at them when they fumbled, her tongue sharp. But when one boy finally got it right, she grinned like she'd mined pure gold. Even Kerr, still sullen after his humiliation in the wreck field, lent his strength to hauling scrap from one bay to another. He did it with a scowl, muttering curses under his breath. But he did it. The others followed his lead, not out of trust, but because leadership, whether they liked him or not, was carved into his bones. Arg watched it all with arms crossed, boots planted, saying little. The work mattered more than words. The first true test came 3 cycles later, when the hydro recycler spluttered and threatened to choke itself dead. Normally, Arg would have handled it himself. This time, he stepped back. "You know what to do," he said. "Show me." The children stared at him like he'd spoken in another tongue. Then Ariel shoved Teo forward, muttering, "Go on, Shadow Boy." Teo swallowed hard, then crouched by the recycler. His hand shook, but he repeated Arg's steps, voice trembling as he narrated. "Shut the valve, check the filters, see the pressure gauge. If it's high, you bleed it out slow." Arg said nothing. He only watched. The recycler hissed, coughed, then steadied under Teo's fumbling care. The boy exhaled like he'd held his breath the whole time. The younger children clapped, soft and awkward. Teo looked up at Arg, waited for judgment. Arg only nodded once. "Good enough." The boy's face lit in a way Arg hadn't seen before. That night, Arg sat alone in the widow's narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling. His body ached from labor, but it was his mind that refused to rest. He saw Teo's hands on the recycler. He heard Ariel's laugh, sharp and proud. He thought of Kerr, grudgingly hauling scrap without being told. It was more than survival. It was the shape of something larger, the beginnings of a crew. And in that thought, Ark's chest tightened. He pictured Kara's face, the faint swell of her belly, the child he hadn't met yet but already felt bound to. Teaching these children wasn't so different. Teaching patience, care, responsibility. Teaching that life wasn't just about breathing, but about keeping others breathing too. Was that what fatherhood meant? Not protection alone, but guidance? Not standing in front of every danger, but teaching how to face danger when he wasn't there? The thought unsettled him more than any gas vent or sparking wire. Far from the derelict, Kara navigated her own lessons. The guild disputes had shifted. Now it was no longer about who owned what strip of rock, but about the fairness of trade itself. Two families accused each other of hoarding. Voices raised in the hub's chamber until Kara feared fists would follow. She stood between them, calm, and resting briefly on the swell beneath her tunic. The child was still little more than a flutter, a secret heartbeat inside her. But it grounded her, made her words steadier. "Quarrels don't fill bellies," she said, voice sharp enough to cut through the shouting. "Aaron food don't care who you hate. If you break this guild apart, the void won't weep for you. It'll only swallow your children." The silence afterward was thick. Both sides glared at her, but neither spoke. Slowly, grudgingly, they sat. Later, alone in her quarters, Kara pressed her palm to her stomach and whispered, "He's out there teaching them too. Just different faces, different children." She smiled faintly, though her eyes burned. She wished Art could hear her. She wished he could see how much they were already shaping a future they hadn't held yet. On the derelict, the orphans' teamwork grew by inches, then strides. They patched leaks without him watching over their shoulders. They rationed without fighting, though arguments still flared. They had begun to share tools, without hiding them in their bunks. Mark didn't praise them. He didn't need to. They didn't need his approval as much as they needed to see themselves succeed. But alone, in the quiet, he allowed himself one thought he hadn't dared before. Maybe they'll live long enough to grow up. And when he thought of his child, unborn, unseen, but waiting, he added another. And maybe I'll know how to guide them when the time comes. The end of part 2 of Void Miner, Children of the Belt.